Okay, hello everyone. I think you can all hear me now. So I want to just welcome you to the Embryology Lounge. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm not sure what you heard before, but this is a very informal discussion of the topic of the day. Please feel free, you can raise your hand and you can be unmuted, and then we can just talk. You can ask questions. If you have feedback, please let me know. I'm happy to, have an interactive discussion through all of this. It is being recorded, just so you know. So in case if you do speak, you will be recorded. So anyway, we will get to the topic of the day, which is critical parameters in IVF. And so this is, an interesting topic in a way. I realize it's not the most interesting, up-to-date, cutting edge topic right now, but it's always important. And I think especially with labs coming back up right now, we need to remember what we're working towards, and it's always improvement, right? So we're always trying to get better for our patients. We've been in the field for a long time now, and so the only way we keep improving is to look at what we're doing and then come up with ways to track that and then get better. Okay. So this is kind of a then and now, looking at how this all started way back in the day. And so, we've come a long way, obviously, and they got less than 1 egg per retrieval. They had a 6% pregnancy rate. And now we're up to, 95% of the time you get eggs in a retrieval. You have a 60% implantation rate per ET. And so the way we got there is to kind of keep track of what we've done, keep track of what we're doing, and come up with ways to improve. And that's the really important thing. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So key performance indicators. I know you've all been to talks about this before. And so it's a set of data that measures how well something or someone is doing. And that's how we know where we need to make improvements, and then gives us an idea of where we can go to make those improvements. And so you have to identify the indicators in every area. There's communication issues, there's technical issues, there's safety measures. And we have some examples there on the little chart. And so, for instance, let's look at gamete preparation, your motile sperm yield. If you set your KPI is to know that how well you're doing with your protocol. And so you want to always keep track of that. Now that takes into account, obviously, that patients will be different, techs will be different, supplies could be different, but you have to know what you're looking at and why you're looking at it. That's really important. And so that's kind of the starting point of what we're looking at. So the next thing are benchmarks. And this is a criterion of quality or service that's expressed as a standard. So this is basically your reference. And this is where you want to be, basically. So you set a goal for what you want to get to, whether that be ICSI rate, lack of damage with COCs when you're stripping for ICSI, recovery rates, all of those kinds of things are all benchmarks. It's a reference that you're trying to hit. And so benchmarking is just the process of doing that, obviously. Okay, so these are some of the things that people can look at while they're benchmarking. So you can look at the number of oocytes per patient. Obviously, that's not under lab control, but that gives your docs an idea of what they're looking at and how they're doing. We talked about the damaged oocytes when you're stripping. Mature oocytes, if you're continually getting all GVs, that's a problem. And I won't read the whole list. You can certainly go through that, but it just gives you an idea of these are things you want to look at. Let's look at, for instance, embryology or embryo utilization rate. So greater than 50% on day 2 and 3. So that's just saying that you want to have 50% of your embryos or better that are still going, that are good quality, that are moving forward, and that you would be able to use them. This is based on a European thing. They do more day 3s there than we do over here. So that's where that comes from. But the idea obviously is that you're watching what you're doing, you're setting it against a standard. And if that falls below where you'd like it to be, you look at your quality improvement plan and figure out how to make that better. So the next thing then is thresholds, and this is setting a critical level of quality. And so you should have thresholds for everything, for your expectations basically in the in your laboratory. So the graph that's up there is for fertilization rate, and you have your KPI, which states that in general, labs across the world expect, say, a 60% fertilization rate. That's the KPI. If you've set your benchmark at 70%, that's great. If that's what you're seeing and that's what you expect and that's what you're working towards, then this is a great way to show that, you know, that doesn't always happen. And so it gives you an idea of what you're looking for and how to get there. So you always want to set the proper thresholds for each indicator, but it's very difficult to do because if you, as in the bottom right, if you set your threshold values too low, you're not going to detect any errors, right? If you set your FERT rate at 20%, pretty much everybody's going to hit that. So you're not going to find a problem. If you set your values too high, you'll never hit them. If you set your rate at 95%, that's not really achievable based on all of the variables that go into it. So you need to set them in exactly the right spot for your laboratory, that you have a true view of your performance and how you're looking as far as whatever your improvement plan is. So these can vary from one lab to another, obviously. And so going back to KPIs and benchmarking and thresholds, those all work together. And so you will hear about KPIs that other labs are using or benchmarks that they have set for their ICSI rates or their FERT rates. And you can use those then in your own program to decide, wow, okay, they're doing much better than we are. I would like to get where they are. And then you kind of work on your improvement plan to get to where you want to be. So the interesting thing about our field is that there are different policies and regulations globally, right? There is not a set amount of standards across the board. And so that can be a problem when we're discussing with each other how to get better and where we should be and where we want to go. And so there have been several things that people have tried to get together and create those kinds of standards for all of us. And so, you know, sometimes the definitions are different, the calculations are different, and there are a couple of consensus groups that have tried to come up with standards for everyone. So the one, Istanbul, was in 2011, and this was based on embryo assessment on morphology. And so it talked about, here's what we see, here's what we hope to see, here's what we expect to see. And they kind of worked through that sort of thing. And if we all can use this and maybe get on the same page and basically be then speaking the same language as far as what we're looking at, that helps a lot of people. And so these papers were put out to kind of try to standardize across the field what we're doing and what we're calling good or not good. And you can see here, again, I won't read it all, but what your trifectoderm looks like, what is a good trifectoderm, what is a fair inner cell mass. And if we can kind of put standards to that, it makes it much easier for everybody else to hit it. So this is then the alpha consensus, which was on cryopreservation in 2012. And so this looked at survival rate, post-thaw development, and did use fresh cycles as a reference. So this is the same sort of thing. We're trying to get to the same basic place and talk about all of the same basic things. And it's just trying to allow us all to improve. When we see where everybody is going, everybody can come along with us in one group, right? Like that's the great thing about science. We put what we're doing out there, we can talk about it, and then other people can improve as well. That's how we move forward as a field. And I think that's really important. To keep going with these kind of consensus papers and try to get on the same page and talk the same language about what's going on in our field. So then another one was the Vienna consensus, and this was in 2017. And this talked about lots of things. It did talk about cryopreservation, but obviously you can see here there are plenty of other things that it talked about. And so it tried to set a standard for what you should expect for a cleavage rate, for a biopsy rate, for all of these things here. And these are all in these papers. If anybody, I know I'm going through this a little quickly, but just pull these papers and you can see how your lab compares to all of those things. And I think that's really important to keep track of where you are, not only in relationship to yourself in your own lab, but each tech in your lab. And then how does your lab compare with labs down the street? And then how does your lab compare with labs across the world? That way we can kind of keep speaking the same language, and we can all continually improve on what we're doing. So there are some things that lack established parameters, and this makes it a little more difficult, right? So sperm recovery is a difficult one because it's very dependent on the patient. I know we have all seen samples where, you know, this count and motility is fine, but for whatever reason, it doesn't wash well, or it doesn't come through a gradient properly. It's hard to make those kinds of choices and know what you're dealing with until you've had it. And then you can improve the next time that patient comes through, of course. But there's no standard because it's just too different between patients. Another option or another instance is the cutoff value for ICSI and IVF. What some people use as a cutoff, whether to decide if they're going to ICSI that patient or do standard IVF, varies widely. So some people will use critical morphology, some people just use count and motility. It's quite interesting. And so those are very hard things to set standards for. The other thing is embryo grading and quality embryos. So that's a very subjective thing, as we all know. We've all been in the lab. So it's really hard to set an absolute standard for what a 3BB is, or, you know, the more difficult ones are like a 2AC or those sort of things. Many people have different views on that, depending on probably the patient history, those sorts of things, but it's very difficult to standardize absolutely across the board. That's what proficiency programs are for, those sorts of things. So I hope everyone is taking advantage of those, and at least try to standardize within your own lab, and then kind of compare where you are to other people. And then you can adjust. If you are the outlier, then it's likely that you would need to adjust. So some other things that we can do to try to improve, continually improve, is obviously continuously monitor all of these things. You always want to know what your FERT rate is, what your oocyte damage rate is, what's your biopsy no read rate, what's all of those things. That's what tells you, based in data, how you're doing. And it's really important that you know those things, not only for each tech in your lab, but your lab as a whole as compared to others nearby and others worldwide as well. And as we talked about, there are definitely external factors that we cannot control. You know, we can't, in the lab, cannot control stim, which, you know, that has a lot to do with the quality of eggs. Certainly on sperm prep, we cannot control what that particular sample is going to look like or how it may behave. And so it's just a matter of judging what you're dealing with when it's right in front of you, and being competent enough to make those decisions as you're going, because you have, because you're aware that you have the ability and the knowledge and the experience to make a choice on what you're doing, so that you can process that particular patient's sample in a way that's going to be best for him. Then the other things are controllable, certainly. Your culture conditions, what temperature your incubators are, what pH you're set at, your CO2 rating. You always want to optimize all of your techs. You want to make sure they go through competency, proficiency testing, trainings, continuously updated trainings. Those are all really important things to make sure that everybody's basically bringing their A game all the time. So very important to keep track of all of those things. So evolving KPIs and paying attention to all of these things, you definitely have to do in your own lab. I cannot say that this benchmark, you know, 70% of anything is going to be across the board all the time for every program, for every tech, all of that. That's something that you have to kind of do in your own lab. You have to decide where you are and where you want to go and how you're going to get there. So that basically is your QI program. And it's really important to be aware of all of those things for a quality lab. So the benchmarks will allow you then to compare to what other labs are doing and how you compare. And so you know, there's always room for improvement, but it's certainly different if you're kind of on the top of the heap versus the bottom of the heap, if you'll pardon that expression. But to just be aware of where you stand in the field and how to improve and what you need to do to get there. So, you know, there are a lot of traditional KPIs as we've talked about through this talk, but there's always new ones that can come up as things change. I mean, certainly we didn't have biopsy KPIs when I started. So things change as the field changes, and that's again part of continuous improvement, is always be aware of what's in the field and always track what you're doing so that you can continually get better. That's the important thing for us, for the patients, everything. So so I know this was a very quick talk, but I just wanted to kind of touch on the topics, and I'm hoping that you all have some things to talk about. Let's see. Then, yes, I did see my typo, but I'm going to be totally honest with you on the date. I realize it's April, not I am not an IT person. And so if I had clicked out of that to refix it and save it, I would have never gotten back in and been able to do this. So that's what I just wanted to, I did notice that, and I do apologize for that. I realize that looks terrible. Let's see here. So so there are no questions in the chat group right now. So I don't know if anybody has any questions or wants to say anything. I know most people are kind of concerned right now with coming back up after COVID. And so this may not be the first thing on your mind right now, but it should be when you get started, because you definitely want to check all of those things, your temperatures, your pHs, especially if you actually physically went down. You need to really be aware of where you are when you're starting. And, you know, I don't think lab techs lose their experiences, obviously, this quickly, but, you know, it is something to be aware of, and that you have to get all of those things back in line when you're coming back up, because you don't want to start up with, you know, your pH off or your temperatures off, or, you know, you need to check all of your media, make sure it's not expired, check all of your dishes and your products and everything to make sure you're good to go. It's, a lot of people are basically starting all over again. And so that's really important to be aware of all of these sorts of things. And then keep your eye on your thresholds when you start back up, and make sure they're in line with where they were previously. Let's see here. So there is a question about vitrification KPIs. And so that was, yeah, that's a good question. So it says that we discussed the lab vitrification KPIs, but not for the clinical part. And that is usually true. And I believe that's actually just because that's out of our control. You know, I can tell you from years now of dealing with both sides is that, and you all know as well, that in the lab, it's always the clinic's fault. In the clinic, it's always the lab's fault. And so it's really hard to get them to pay attention to those sort of things. And I think it's much harder, and maybe I think this because I'm in the lab, but collecting data on patients is a little different than in the lab, right? Because in the lab, if you're keeping track of how Sally's sperm preps look, you can kind of collect that data across the board and see where she is in her preparations. When you are comparing, you know, Mary to Francis to whoever on their STEM protocols, well, that's, you know, different BMIs, different diagnoses, different, do they smoke or not? You know, there's all kinds of things. And my guess is they keep track of, you know, which meds are which stims for which patients and those sorts of things. But practicing medicine is an art as well. And so I think sometimes they change things based on what they think it should be doing versus, you know, in the lab where we can actually test what it is doing. So that's the hard part about that. But yeah, I think to answer the question, KPIs do need to be updated and looked at. continually. And my hope would be that these consensus meetings continue and grow, because I think the more people who add their differences in, and the more data we can look at, the better off we'll be in what we end up with and how we can all perform. So let's see here. So there's something here. Balance between gametes or embryo quality and lab quality is enough to know the way to follow to become better. Is that true? Lab quality is enough to know the way to follow to become better. So, okay, here's how I see it. All of these are pieces of a puzzle, right? So you definitely want to look at your gamete quality. Important, obviously. If you start with bad quality eggs and or sperm, you're not likely to get good embryos. Can you process, quote, bad sperm in a way that you'll get the best sperm that's possible to meet with your eggs to hopefully end up with better embryos? That's the hope, right? Can I prove that? No, because you can't take the bad sperm and the good sperm with the same eggs and find a difference there, right? You have to just get the best quality sperm that you can from what we know looks good. Take the eggs, honestly, that were given. By the time they come to us, there's not a whole lot we can do about changing that. And then in the laboratory, we can deal with our temperatures, with our pH, with the growth media, with the right dishes, everything we can control, that even if that egg is of subpar quality, we've already processed the sperm to get the, quote, best sperm. We're dealing with the eggs in the best possible environment we can give them, with techs that are experienced and proficient and have met the thresholds of what we expect. I think that's how we can control it in the future. You know, that's how we have to move forward, because there definitely are a lot of things that are just out of our control. Do I consider the MET2 oocyte collected to be the last clinical KPI? That's a good, everybody's looking at live birth rate, but we do not use all the same measures. Yes, that's exactly right. And so I would agree with that. Honestly, I've not thought of that. But yeah, the MET2 oocytes collected is really the last thing that the clinic has had their hands in that we can measure. Because again, we go back to, if you're getting all GVs, then something was wrong with stim protocols. If you're getting all degenerate atretic eggs, something is wrong with the stim protocol. So I think that's a really good point. And I agree that people do look at live birth rate, but that's out of our hands, really. I mean, the minute we do a transfer, we can't control whether a patient has taken their progesterone properly, or, continued with those things, or, any number of crazy things. Did they go sit in a hot tub for a solid week? Did they climb Mount Everest? I don't know, but those are all things out of our control. So I agree with you that live birth rate isn't really a lab indicator. And even as a clinical indicator, there's so many things that is out of everyone's control. I'm not really sure how well that technically shines a light on the things that are going on in the clinic. Oh, interesting. I didn't realize that. Even the definition of live birth is different. Wow, that one seems pretty straightforward. Interesting. So yeah, but that's the problem with what we're looking at, is there is no standard. And, as we talk about, there is a ton of gray in this field, very little black and white. And so when it comes down to trying to collect this information and see how you are doing, and determine where you are in relationship to everyone else, and where you want to be. I mean, even if you didn't look at everybody else, you need to determine where you want to be and where are you actually, and then go from there. And a lot of these things are fluid. You can set your rate at 70%, but if you're consistently hitting 73%, well, then maybe you need to move it to 75 and then work on that improvement. Like, you should always want to try to get better. You should not stagnate in any way, because that's how these improvements are made in this field. And that's how we all get better. That's how the patients get better care. So let's see here. Do you consider in this situation that we need to establish a set of definitions and a set of KPI? Yeah, like Vienna. In a perfect world, yes. But clearly it's difficult to do because so many people coming on from so many different perspectives and different parts of the world, and those sorts of things. I think people have tried. It's just really difficult to set that one standard. And so I think it would be great, certainly to try. I mean, honestly, I'm going to say people far smarter than I would have to sit down and really hammer out where we need to be. And I think it's something that needs to be continually looked at because these things change. As I mentioned, ICSI wasn't always around. Biopsy certainly wasn't always around. So things have to be added and changed. And, if we compare to the back then where we transferred 5 2PNs and now we're transferring 1 blast, that has to change. Everything is constantly changing in this field. So, which I think is a good thing. I think that's how we get better. So, yeah. So there you go. So I don't know if anybody, oh, wait. So your benchmark parameters will be more accurate and unbiased in your donor program or cycles using donors. What do you think on that? I'd have to think about that a minute. So it definitely seems like donors are certainly, usually young, healthy patients. And so certainly for your embryo quality and oocyte quality, I definitely would expect that to be better. But I'm not quite sure how realistic that really is because I know that some programs don't filter their patients at all, right? They'll take whatever patient walks in the front door and they'll do their best for them. And, and that's going to get reflected in what their results are. Whereas a clinic that only takes, under 30 and donors, and of course, they're going to look fantastic in the stats. Does that really make them better? I would argue that. But that's just me. That's my opinion. So I'd love to hear if anybody wants to type in or unmute and tell me what your opinion is. I would love to hear it because that's a really interesting point. Anybody who's using basically the best of the standards is going to have a different rate than people who are doing real patients. And that's the uncontrollable part of all of this, right? So, okay, here's another one. Looking at EIM data from ESHRA, there is a huge use of ICSI. Yeah. Sometimes there are IVF units that are doing exclusively ICSI. Yes, there is. How do you comment in the context that there are no cutoffs for the use of IVF with ICSI? So again, this is the problem. My personal opinion is we should not be doing near as much ICSI as we are. ICSI should be used for deficient sperm parameters, and that's it. I can tell you that I have seen it used exactly as you're talking about, extensively in clinics. I know it's easier. I know docs don't want to make that no-FERT phone call. I know timing of it sometimes with labs, and you have 12 retrievals that day, and you have to be able to bang them out when you can. I understand all of that. I do. But again, totally my opinion. But as many strides as we have made in this field, there is a ton we don't know. And we may be bypassing things that just are really important. And so in my opinion, ICSI should only be done for bad sperm. Well, subpar sperm, I don't mean to say bad, but yeah, so I don't think using ICSI all the time is a good thing. And I don't know how to, that's again, so many things in this field. Even if we come up with a consensus meeting that says that, and even if we set that as a standard, how do you make people do it? I don't know. That's the interesting thing. I think particularly here in the US, I think Europe has less of a problem with that. At least, again, going back to kind of the closings with COVID, is that when their government says to do this, people do it. In the US, it's a little different for us. And so I think, there was quite the debate going on when all of this happened about clinics being open versus clinics being closed versus essential versus elective. And I think that was really interesting. But I think it's kind of the same thing with ICSI. If the patients want it and or the docs want it, and maybe there are some labs who like it because they can schedule it a little better. I don't know how we'll get around that, but My personal opinion is it's not a good idea, that you should only use ICSI when it's absolutely necessary, as any other medical procedure. So there you go. Maybe that'll get me some mail, but okay, let's see here. In the COVID-19 pandemic, and considering that ZP is a protective shield, we can consider as a safety measure not to use ICSI, at least when it's not absolutely necessary. Interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, there was a whole bunch of talk, and I am underprepared on the coronavirus, just so you know, the types of receptors it has and all of that. There was some discussion on that the last webinar, and it's very interesting. So I guess I can't speak on a molecular level if that would really work, that if you didn't use ICSI, then COVID couldn't enter. I don't know that to be true, so I won't speak too much to that, but that's a really interesting point. Oh, Deepti, excellent question. Okay, so has anyone out there, labs or no agencies that I know of, but possibly if there's someone on from other countries, have they set KPIs and a QI program for AI? So that's an interesting, really interesting question, because I'm wondering if that is where we will start to see some standardization, right? Because once AI takes over, and I do believe it's going to eventually, it's going to be much more standardized. And I think it will be much more likely that we may be able to start comparing apples to apples. So now I don't think that's going to be obviously immediate in the next couple of years, but we will see. Oh, wait a minute. I lost my... Okay, somebody, oh, there we go. I was gonna say someone's sharing their screen. That's not me, so I don't, I don't know. Interesting. Okay, well, I don't know if that's going on, and now I lost my chat room as well. So hold on one second here. Oh, there we go. So anyway, does anybody, I don't know if anybody's really using AI yet. I know there's a couple labs trialing it, but they do not have set standards yet. But I think that's a really good question, Deep, because I do think that's going to happen for sure. Let's see here. So then frequent lab staff change is another variable and should be considered. That's an excellent point. Well, and I think that's why you should always keep your standards not only for your lab, but even per tech, because definitely your more experienced techs are going to have a different level of, say, ICSI rate than your people who are just starting it. There's no doubt about that. And so, yeah, that would skew your data for sure. So if you can kind of pull out all the new people and what they're doing and then look at your overall, that's the way to kind of explain that basically. And so then you can watch your newer people as they improve. And I will tell you, as you know, what can happen as well as your experienced people, no offense to experienced people out there, I understand because I'm one of them, but experienced people can get lax. So not only can newbies improve, experienced people can do worse, because you just get used to it. You get in a rut. You've done it so many times that you're not really paying attention as you should. And so your rates can start to go down. So that's why I think it's important that you watch each individual person. And I don't mean it, watch them, but have their data as well as for your entire lab. Do we in the US have a set of KPIs mandatory for licensing? Not that I know of. I am not a lab director, so I will qualify that. But there's, other than inspections, it's not an absolute set of anything. It's how you interpreted the standards for your inspection, and then you need to prove to them what you did to solve that issue. And then that's how, and they will accept that. So it's kind of how you interpret it, what you did about it, and how it's working in your lab. That's how it works here. As far as I know, please type in if I'm completely wrong on that. Happy to hear. Let's see here. In what part of embryo development do you think it will affect the most if embryos are cultured at the incorrect pH? Oh boy. Well, I would have to say that it would depend on if you're too high or too low. So obviously sperm, if you're doing a standard IVF, sperm like a different pH than embryos do. Most people that I know of don't have embryos, incubators, set at different pHs for different stages. Although, when you look at the theory of it, we probably all should. I think this goes back to then the continuous versus sequential culture discussion of, is one better than the other, or are they just, quote, good enough? And, the embryos are more hardy than we give them credit for, or are we causing some kind of epigenetic damage? I think we just don't know. So I think pH will affect it at every point, quite frankly. But I can't honestly tell you on a molecular level exactly how and at what stage. Again, I'm not sure that any of us absolutely know that, especially the whole epigenetic side of things, but certainly, sperm like a different pH than early embryos, than later embryos, that sort of thing. But again, with all of the continuous data that we have now, it seems to be fine, but, I don't know, 10 years or 5 years of data, is that enough to know for sure? I don't really know that. So it's an ongoing thing, and I'm thrilled that people are still researching it. So, okay, so here's an answer. Per cap, you need benchmarks, but there's no threshold available at the moment. So that answers the question previously about the set of KPIs mandatory for licensing. So CAP is one of the inspection agencies, and so you do need to have your benchmarks, but no threshold. So there you go. Do you consider a double buffered media as a solution? Yes. So certainly that definitely provides some solutions. Excuse me, I'm sorry. And what is your opinion of the KPIs for andrology and sperm? Well, I think that's where it kind of goes back to, it's difficult to say. So you can look at certainly maybe percent recovery, but that's going to change based on quality of semen for sure. But I don't know if you look at a person across the board where they, here we go back to all the donors. Do people who process donor sperm probably have a better recovery rate than somebody who's in a clinical lab that treats all 45-year-olds? Probably. And is that fair to compare? Not in my opinion. But, one is kind of realistic, one is kind of has the A-team. So it depends on how you're looking at it and what you're looking for, right? And so, in my opinion, the double buffered media is a solution because it does have the different buffers for different temperatures. And I think it depends a lot. Some people put their sperm into an incubator after processing. Some people leave it at room temperature. So that's where the double buffer would come in and help, is that if you have it at 37 and at room temperature, heaps and mops certainly work. You have a different pKa at different temperatures. And so that would cover your bases more. But if you're somebody who doesn't, once it's liquefied and you've processed it, if you leave it at room temperature, then, I'm not sure how much that would help you in that particular instance, because, heaps works best at 37. So, yeah, so that's my opinion on that. Let's see here. Is it good to culture each patient's embryos in 2 culture media? Another good question. In my opinion, yes. We did that in my lab. I think it's a fantastic idea. I will tell you honestly, when we started it, we all grumbled because it's twice the work and it's twice. But realistically, once you get used to doing it, it's not a big deal. You're setting up the same basic number of drops, just in 2 different dishes. I think it's a good idea because we consistently had, over the years, sometimes patients would do better in one than the other with no real explanation found on our part. I think it's just whatever's in the culture media that some patients just for whatever reason like that one better. And so they did well in it. Had we only been using one media, that patient either could have been fantastic or really awful. And so we covered our bases and did everybody in two. And, you know, I think it improved our endpoint basically. You know, it is a little bit of extra work, but once you get used to it, it's not a big deal at all. And so someone's asking me if I split in my lab. So yes, when I was on the bench, yes, we did. I'm not in a lab right now, so I'm full-time with Irvine, but so I think it's a great idea because I think and most lab people I know are willing to do a little bit of extra work if it's better for the patients. And some patients, it absolutely doesn't matter. I will be honest about that as well. But in some patients, it absolutely does. And we were grateful to have both because we couldn't have known which one they're going to do better in. And it was 50-50. It wasn't like one media was always the one that did better. It's split. And so I really think it comes down to what the patient's embryos prefer. And so it's kind of like we were happy to provide that. If we could improve our rates and do better for the patient, we were willing to do it. So I thought it was really good. What is the minimum number of eggs to split into two media? Okay, another interesting opinion. So it depends on your lab. You could split two. I mean, let's be honest, you could. I don't know how much interesting data that would give you other than if one did well and one didn't, you'd be glad you split. I do know that particularly with group culture, most people want them in a group, right? Because then that also helps grow better quality blast, it certainly seems. And I know some labs have a set number of embryos. They want at least 5 embryos in their dish. And so they would not split less than 10, or they might do 5 and 3 or something like that. That's a very individual lab director preference thing as far as I can tell, because again, no standard. It's kind of what people have worked out in their culture systems, in their lab for their patient population. And so that's again, coming back to why it's important to do those things for your lab and your patients, because there is no set absolute black and white standard. There just isn't. So again, maybe with AI, we'll get there. That will be really interesting. So what is the minimum number of oocytes to decide to ICSI if there's no sperm issue? Well, going back to what I said, even if there was only one egg and absolutely no sperm issue, I would not ICSI. I just don't think it's necessary. I think if the sperm there's no reason to believe. It could be an egg quality issue, could be a stim issue, could be a diagnosis issue. We don't know. But if the egg is quality, it's mature upon retrieval, there would be absolutely no reason to ICSI it because, in my opinion, you then, yes, you definitely have a chance of no-fert. I get that, you do. But you also have a chance of, when you're stripping it, you break the zona and it dies. You have the chance of when you ICSI it, it's a poor quality oocyte with, you know, very watery kind of cytoplasm that leaks all out and it dies. There are the chances that even if you ICSI it, it may not have all the mechanisms that it needs to process it to become a 2PN. And so whether that's from ICSI or IVF, it's really hard to pinpoint that, right? And I realize, again, clinic versus lab, the minute you get a no-fert and you didn't ICSI it, they're going to blame it on the lab for not ICSIing it. I get that. But I don't think that's the case. I think that's just the easy solution. And then the docs will tell the patient, it's no big deal. We'll ICSI next time. It's going to be fine. Well, will it? We don't know. And even if you ICSI it, and even if it's a 2PN, does that make it a quality embryo? Well, no. I mean, biopsy has told us that that's not the case. You can have a beautiful 3BB embryo or 3AA embryo that just genetically isn't going to make it. So it's all a beauty contest. We're doing the best we can. We're going on our experience, on what we can see, and possibly, in my opinion, the IVF, you know, maybe even better because, again, you're bypassing a lot with ICSI that we don't really know about yet. And so if you let, quote, nature take its course, maybe it will be a better embryo than it would be if you had ICSI'd it. My opinion. Let's see here. In your lab, day 3s or day 5 is the majority for ET. So in most labs that I know of here in the US, it's day 5. Very few doing day 3 embryo transfers anymore. There's probably some, and that's based on either a very low egg number retrieved or very low, decent quality embryos. If and she's, advanced maternal age, those sorts of things, they may be more likely to put those in earlier, just as a kind of a let's get it back to where it needs to be kind of thing. But most people now are going to day 5s, in the States anyway. So, and what is the highest percent protein in Fuji one-step media? So we have two. We have the complete, which is 5% HSA, which is basically the same as 10% SSS. So like most people who add their own protein will add SSS. And so if you wanted to add your own, you would get the unsupplemented and add 10% SSS, which would be equivalent to 5% HSA, volume to volume. So that's the highest we sell. I know most people are doing extra protein either for post-thaw, for FETs. Some people do it for standard transfers, those sorts of things. And we do not offer a high protein pre-made media. I think there's talk about that, so I can't say that we may never have it, but I tell you we don't have it now. But that's an interesting question because there are people who are using more and more protein out there. So, and there's mixed opinions on that as well. So very interesting. So anyway, oh, here. Learn in the US, there are several clinics that perform PGT as a routine on all patients. What is your opinion considering that we all pick up the best embryo based, as you said, on a beauty contest? Yeah, so I definitely think PGT has its place. I think obviously recurrent pregnancy loss, multiple cycles with no pregnancy, advanced maternal age, certainly if you have something that runs in your family, very important to have them tested. I know of clinics who are doing PGT on donors. And no offense to anyone, I'm just here on my soapbox saying I don't get that. It's an added expense. It's an added, it's trauma to the embryos. And yes, we've certainly proved that they can handle it. I mean, there's plenty of that goes on. I get it. But why induce more trauma if we don't need it? And the chances that a donor embryo is going to be abnormal, I mean, it's certainly possible. It's certainly possible. I get it, but it's kind of a game of playing the statistics, in my opinion. And I don't believe that needs to be done. But again, not a lab director, so it's not my call. But knowing that beautiful embryos aren't always normal, and normal embryos aren't always beautiful. Let's be totally honest and put it out there because that's the truth too. I would guess, I certainly know I have been surprised upon getting PGT results and looking at the embryo that they're matched to. But that's the reality of our field is, I mean, I feel like sometimes we're doing the best we can based on our experience, which is why all of this benchmarking and thresholds are important because we keep learning. You know, what we thought we knew, we may not know next year. So we have to stay on that and we have to keep learning and keep collecting information. Does high protein decrease ICSI degeneration rate? Not that I know of, but that I do not have any data one way or the other. I guess based on my opinion, I thought that ICSI degeneration was typically due to mechanical problems. So I don't think any amount of protein would kind of heal anything. But maybe if there's some kind of micromolecular problem that maybe higher protein, wow, I would have to look into that is the bottom line answer. I have not heard that before, so I don't know. Another question, if non-invasive PGT will be in place, will this become a standard procedure? It certainly seems like it should. I mean, anything we can do to prevent damage to the embryo seems to be a good thing. And if we can get the information that we need about that embryo and we could do it non-invasively, absolutely. I think the problems now are that there's not a method out there that gives us as good as rates as obviously invasive, taking the actual cells. So I know they've looked at spent media and things like that, but as far as I know, they've not hit the same standards. So until that happens, I don't see that it will really take over as a standard. Mandatory minimum KPIs for labs. Well, that's kind of what we talked about through here. They're different. I mean, there are KPIs out there, and I'd have to go back to the slide to know exactly what they all are, but I don't know that really, again, this is my opinion. In the US, I don't think there's any rule or law against running a terrible lab. If you open a terrible lab and you have nobody watching you and you're selling your services and your doc's on board, I think you could operate that lab. I don't think there's any absolute rule that says you must hit 60% fertilization or you must hit, that's kind of scary to me, but I think that's true. Now, once you become a quality lab and you have trained people and a PhD director and a CAP inspection, yes, then certainly you have standards. For the more thresholds you want to cross, the higher the standards. So it's possible, but it's also possible to not hit any of them. As far as I know, somebody please type in if I'm wrong on that, but as far as I know, there's no, I mean, just like any other doctor's practice, you could be a terrible heart surgeon and all your patients die, but well, that probably the medical board would probably look at you, I guess, at that point. But, you know, it's just different here that unless your docs are mad or somebody maybe complains, but there's no absolute set of standards for everybody. So. Excellent point. Okay, so just typed into that SART does define some minimum KPIs. And the worst part is that if you absolutely stink at what you're doing, you're not going to get any business. And so eventually, because people do compare, that's the interesting thing about this patient population, right? Is that most of them are, I can't say most, many are a little older, educated, you know what they're doing, know what they're looking for. And so they research. And they'll know what the clinic down the street's numbers were, and they'll compare. Now, we all know it shouldn't be used in that way, but let's face it, it is. And so if you can't, provide quality data and show that you know what you're doing, yeah, you're not going to get any business. So maybe that's how they get weeded out. Thank you for that. Oh, excellent point. I'm so sorry, Kepler. You're absolutely right. I should not have said PhDs. ELDs, very important, same thing. People running labs, that's what I should have said. That's a position I have not been in. So that's absolutely right. And yes, he confirmed no mandatory KPIs in the US yet. So it's one of those things that I wonder if it's coming. Eventually, I think, oh, sorry. Sorry, that's my cat. Anywho, so yes, so anyway, I think they're probably coming eventually someday. I think maybe the government has enough on its plate right now, but eventually there will be probably more standards, especially that it's common in other countries. So I do think it will come around to that. Let's see here. The embryos evolve while developing. I think PGT results may not be 100% reflective of true embryo outcome. What are your thoughts? Ooh, yeah, I've been in a lot of talks about that. That's a very interesting topic. Particularly, obviously, where mosaics come into play, right? So you don't know, and I guess that could be true even of the abnormals, right? So if you took the quote section of abnormal cells from the trophectoderm, and you call that embryo abnormal, but then there's that whole, do embryos self-correct? Do they get rid of those cells? I don't think there's an answer to that yet. But but it's an excellent point that we don't really know. Mosaics certainly make it worse, but even, and the same could be true of the normal. So maybe you just got the one normal section. I don't know. You know, I don't know if anybody was around back in the days of the day 3 fish, but I mean, it's certainly way better than that. Certainly way better than that. But yeah, is it an absolute, can we say absolute 100% normal or abnormal, even if we get that result? My opinion is no. It would be very interesting, actually. I'm not aware if there's any studies out there that compare, I would assume probably for mosaics, and possibly even if people transferred, quote, abnormal embryos and then did testing later on in utero, how often they comparatively were equal. That would be a very interesting piece of data that I actually do not have off the top of my head. So I apologize for that. And that, so I'm trying to think, what are my thoughts? Yeah, so I don't think it's 100% reflective of the true embryo. I mean, it's certainly better than where we were, certainly better than day 3, which was better than nothing. But 100% no, I certainly would not go there with it. So, well, very good. I don't see any other questions here. Thank you all so much for being here. It's been wonderful. I'm sorry for being up on my soapbox, but that's what that's what happens when you give me a platform to tell everybody my opinions. And please, I'm so happy that you all texted back in, because I think that's what makes it interesting, is a live discussion. So anyway, thank you so much for being here. And I'm glad y'all got to see the cat. Sorry about that, unprepared for that. But I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Please stay safe. And let me know if you have any topics you'd like to see in these over the next few weeks, or anything like that. We'd love to hear, because we want to make this what everybody wants to hear. And so just a place to kind of talk about things. It's perfect. So there you go. All right.